First, in New York City, we have about 600 of what we call community gardens. These are, for the most part, city-owned land, very small parcels, too small to be developed, or that originally were intended for development, but people were temporarily gardening on them, and then we came to a legal agreement to allow them to continue. So you have a lot of sort of self-starting urban agriculture. We also have a few more intensive things happening. In Brooklyn, an old abandoned park, big asphalt lot has been converted into an urban farm, something called added value. In the Brooklyn Navy Yard, they're getting ready to build a very large rooftop commercial farm, and there are a few models for rooftop commercial farms. I think the problem with urban agriculture in a city like New York or Singapore is there's not lots of open vacant land. You'll find very small parcels in very challenging circumstances. If you're next to railroad tracks, for example, they'll be narrow, dangerous, and full of pollutants and heavy metals that you don't want to grow in. So while I think there is room for more agriculture, large intensive agriculture in an urban setting seems unlikely, or it would cost so much it just doesn't make sense. What makes more sense is to promote the preservation of farmland around the cities, the green belts, through direct sale of their products from the farmer direct to the consumer. And so we have in New York City farmers markets, which were, I should tell you, started by my father 35 years ago, where that enables the farmer to sell directly to the consumer, bypassing the middleman, and allows the small farms not just to survive, but to thrive and increase. So I don't think there's a huge future for urban agriculture. It should be tried where there's open space, but most cities don't have a lot of open space left. The city, as I mentioned before, is blessed by having some of the finest municipal water in the world because many years ago, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the city bought a lot of land up in the Catskill Mountains and at first they did the Croton water system, which was, they dammed a river in Westchester. The water in the aquifer below New York City and in the natural springs became polluted very early in the city's history. By the early 18th century, you could not drink the water from wells in New York anymore. People were getting sick, cholera, yellow fever, all these terrible diseases were coming through because of dirty water. And it wasn't until the clean water system came in the 1840s that you didn't have these terrible epidemics anymore. You could also put out fires. We did this by buying upstate communities and flooding them, by creating these huge reservoirs, and entire towns were put out of existence. So there's a great deal of tension between the upstate communities and the city of New York over the fact that the city is almost like the Roman Empire, going up there and building dams. But on the other hand, this drinking water is important for the 8.5 million New Yorkers and the tourists and the visitors who come there. And I think we can all do a much more responsible job of managing our water resources, not wasting it. I think in particular, as the professor has said, capture the stormwater, capture the gift that the rain gives us, and use that for irrigation rather than using clean drinking water for irrigation. The expense of turning gray water into clean water is probably not worth it for now in New York, but if you have long-term climate change, if we become much drier and not wetter, then we'll need to do things like consider things like new water. I think the secret to preserving the impetus and the energy that's behind Plan YC is what made Plan YC work in the first place, which is this was not a top-down exercise, and it wasn't a bottom-up exercise. It was a combination. Plan YC was developed with a very public process involving particularly NGOs and what we call advocates in New York, people in the environmental community, experts in their various fields. Were involved with every stage of developing this plan. And we went public with it to community groups, and at every step, the advocates and the representatives of the NGOs were involved with developing the plan. That's also been the secret to the success of the parks. The improvement of the parks over the last 3 decades has come because it's been from outside of the government that a lot of the impetus has come with these friends of groups, these NGOs. We come and go in government, particularly those who are elected, but the NGOs are more permanent even than the permanent government, and they can provide the continuity. So I think, Professor, that the secret of maintaining this big new effort in having a more sustainable city, a greener city, with much more to do. I mean, we're just barely touching the rising sea levels, global climate change. Many of us live in cities because of maritime trade. That's where the historic development. All of us who live at sea level are facing this really emerging problem of rising sea levels and increasing storm intensity. We have many big problems to solve, and I think that will be solved. Government plays an important role, but it's the people who will keep our feet to the fire from outside of government that will make sure that this initiative continues after this mayor and this administration leave office.